Today, I have the cold case detective, J Warner Wallace, on the show to talk a little bit about his new book, The Truth in True Crime: What Investigating Death Teaches Us About the Meaning of Life. Jim is the author of Cold Case Christianity, the most featured detective on Dateline NBC, one of my favorite shows that also gives me nightmares. And I'll explain that a little bit. And just an all around good husband, good father, and mentor. Jim also helps police officers and their wives by speaking at retreats specifically designed to help them with their marriages. And personally, I've met Jim at the Cross Examine Instructors Academy. I've also had him as an instructor a few years ago in his Cold Case Christianity class, where I learned so much. And then my oldest son, Wyatt, took Jim's Cold Case Christianity class online and he loved it. And I think Jim is one of his favorite apologists. And so, one of the things that stands out to me about Jim is how highly he speaks of his wife. And I don't know, I love that because he keeps his family first. And then he encourages us as apologists to keep our eyes on God and our families first as well. Jim, I'm so excited that you're on the show today. I've had people ask specifically when I'm going to have J Warner Wallace on the show.
Oh my gosh, that's so. I mean, it's so. I'm honored, and you're right. I can't even like talk about Susie usually. I always know that when you're on the stage, you don't talk about the things that you deeply love because you're going to end up tearing up over them, right? So I
Yeah.
always try not to say much on the stage about Susie, but if I do, I'm just going to end up tearing up. But so much of what we learn about marriage, you learn. Sometimes if we're not intentional, we kind of learn by accident. And we were not Christians for the first 18 years that we were married, that we were together anyway. We waited 9 years before we got married. So it was about 8 or 9 years into our marriage that we became Christians. And a lot of the stuff that we learned, you kind of learn the hard. You have no idea how many people are murdered by their spouse.
Yeah.
You know,
Uh,
I know that sounds terrible, but Gaffigan, the comedian, has this bit he does about Dateline where he talks about how it used to be like a 2020 show where they were just doing like news, and then suddenly they lit on fire doing spousal murder. Well, and it sounds like every episode starts with they were the perfect couple, and then
yes.
someone's getting killed. That's what he
Okay.
always says.
So I'm telling you that when I watch Dateline, the ones where the husband or wife kill each other doesn't scare me. But when there's a random act of violence, it
Uh,
freaks me out. And then I have like I locked all the doors and
yeah, right.
I will get up and go lock all the doors, check, make sure that they're locked. And then it just puts me like in this creepy mood. Whereas I told
Yeah.
Dean, I'm like, and I'll go through scrolling through some of them like on Hulu or something, and I'll look at the description. And if I'm like, yeah, the husband did it, we'll watch that one because I don't want to be scared. So
Well,
I
and
don't know what I
Susie
don't,
won't. Yeah, Susie won't watch them. She won't watch any of them. She's seen all mine, all my
yeah.
Datelines, but she hasn't seen anybody else's because it's the same thing. It's like at some point, and it's interesting that you think that the ones that are the least scary are the ones because that means that you have great confidence in your ability to select a spouse that won't kill you. Now,
That's what
I
I
don't want to,
said. I said
right?
that.
Yeah, and I don't want to shake that confidence. Okay, but one of the things I learned working these cases, because most of my cases are cold cases, those are just cases. Now, not all of them are. I've worked a bunch of fresh murders too, but and I describe some of those in this book. But the cold cases are mostly spousal, and not all of them, but most of them. And what you discover is that these are just regular folks. Um, I think that most of us, without a Christian background, without understanding, this is one of the chapters in this book. If you don't understand the kind of the nature of humans, we have a tendency to divide the world between good and bad. And if
Mhm.
you're on one side of the table interviewing somebody who you're suspect of a murder, well, you clearly think I'm on the good side of humanity. You're on the bad, and we're so utterly different. I could never do something like this.
Sure.
But the reality of it is that the more you search your own heart, and the more you search his, and you realize this is just a guy. He's not a serial killer. He did one murder 30 years ago. Does he regret it? Yes. Has he like changed he's exemplary in all other areas right now. I mean, he's a doctor, he's a teacher, he's a principal of the school. These are just regular folks. And that shook me a little bit. Now, by the time I was working these cold cases, the first one I opened, I wasn't a Christian yet, but by the time I was working them in my stride, and that's all I was working was cold cases, I was already a believer, and I was able to kind of navigate. So this is what we're trying to do in this book, right? 15 true crime stories. I get it. People are interested in true crime. 15 things you learn about human nature from working true crime stories. And I'm going to give you all the support that there is out there in the secular world for the data, and that's all cited in the book. And then 15 ways that the Christian worldview has always taught these principles. And if you just knew your Bible, you wouldn't need the last 35 years of sociological research because it's been in the scriptures all along.
Yeah.
This is not a book that's really making a case. It's not like a case like my cold case
Right.
Christianity. This is really pastoral. This is like, hey, if you wanted to flourish as a believer or otherwise, because I say in the book, if you aren't a believer, you'd be smart to act like it's true. This, by the way, this is what Dawkins, I think, is finally coming to it. The
Yeah.
famous atheist.
Yeah.
I think he's finally realizing, yeah, I don't think it's true, and I'm not willing to be a Christian, but I sure like a culture that lives as though it is true.
Yeah.
Well, okay, that tells us something, right?
Yeah.
If Christianity is true, it ought to describe the world the way it really is. It ought to describe you and me the way we really are, and it does. So that's the kind of book I wanted to write this time.
Yeah, I've been listening to it. Two of my boys, my older two, we share an Audible account, and so we all are always trading. And I'm like, you guys got to read Jim's book because it's it's so applicable. Like you said, you're not talking about like making a case for God's existence or anything. You're actually just telling us what you've learned in your experience as being a cold case detective. But
Mhm.
it's so clever because it's through the lens of these true crimes and human nature, which to me, it grabs every one of your opening chapters grabs me because you're telling a story about one of your cases. But
Mhm.
why do you think I feel like, when you go by a car accident and you don't want to look, but you can't not look. So you're like, you like
Yes.
look.
You know
I
what
feel
every
like
cop,
that's
by the
what
way,
true crimes.
yes, you know what every cop does, by the way, when that happens. Okay, we're in traffic and we see on our, on your mapping system that there's like, clearly there's an accident right here, and the traffic is red up to the accident, and then everything's green or blue after that. Okay, so we're in that thing and we're going, please, people, it's just an accident. It's not
Yes.
just drive. Are you
Yeah.
people so bored that you think this isn't going to be entertaining? But
Yeah.
we all do, right? Now, I don't. First thing I'm just, I refuse to look. Like I'm thinking,
Yeah.
no one should be looking. We should just be driving.
Yeah.
But that's just our frustration. I think a lot's been written on this actually, because I was getting asked always, well, why do you think we're interested in true crime? Why did we slow down for that accident? And I don't, there's a couple things. I think we love to puzzle. Part of it is we want to solve the case, and this is why every Dateline episode is written a certain way, so that although we know from the beginning who did it, we could just hop on and be done in 10 minutes. We are going to slowly unpack it, and even the producers will say to you, well, was there a suspect early on that you thought it might be that it wasn't? They would love it if there was a false lead.
Yeah.
They would love it if they could chase a rabbit on the screen in the story so that everyone thinks, oh, okay,
Yeah.
so of course there's always other people you examined that, but you might have thought, well, no, I never really thought this was our guy, but we're going to make it sound like he's our guy for the
Dateline does
first
that.
three segments,
Yeah.
yeah, and then eventually we're going to pivot
Yep.
toward the real guy. So this is what's why we doing that, because we recognize that a lot of the viewership is driven by people who want to puzzle. They
Mhm.
want to solve the crime before anybody else in their family solves it. Oh, I can see it so and so. And I think the best episodes are the ones that surprise you. Because I mean, I watch a lot of Dateline too, because my friends are still producers, and I love Keith Morrison. I think he's a great guy. So I watch these silly things, and I'm like, ah, this is not well produced because I already know. I don't want it. The best production is when you don't know, because it's leveraging one of the reasons why we watch. Now, the other reason that I was reading recently, and a woman who wrote an article, because she was noting that it doesn't perplex her that we're interested in true crime. What perplexes her is that dominantly it's females who are interested in true crime.
Hmm.
So it's not evenly divided. It's like a 70-30 women audience in true crime podcasts, true crime, all of it. Why? She's arguing that it's because most of the time the suspect's a guy. And so women sometimes will watch to see, how can I not be a victim?
Mm.
What did this victim do wrong that I can make sure I don't? So there, it's kind of like what I write in this book. It's 15 cautionary tales. We often watch true crime shows because they're cautionary tales, and we want to see, like, what can I do better? Like that's probably why when you're but when you see, this is one chapter of the book, it talks about friendships, because it turns
Yeah.
out that these crimes are I remember when I wrote this, I had an earlier reviewer of it when we were doing the video, and she was much younger. So I'm a boomer, so she was probably like top end of Gen Z or bottom end of the millennials, and she thought, "Are you victim blaming when you say this? This seems feels like big." I think the culture kind of is moving in the direction where if I offer you wisdom, you shouldn't have done that.
Mm,
If she hadn't have done this, she'd still be alive today. Can I say something like now? It's true when I talk to a jury, we're going to say that this is the one pivotal thing that if she had not done, and that's going to expose who the killer is actually.
mm,
This thing that she did is going to tell us because only he would have had access if she was to do this thing. And if she hadn't have done this, she'd be alive today. Well, that's not to blame the victim. Of course, we don't blame victims. But there is a lot of a cautionary tale is a tale that says to you, I don't want to do what that person did because that's what ultimately was the first domino that led to destruction. And if we're going to say that we can't offer advice about how to do something better, then what is the book of Proverbs? I mean,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
just filled with practical advice not to hang out with fools. If you're going to hang out with fools, you're going to get this bad result. Are you victim blaming the fool? No, of course not. We're saying that we want you to take a better way. So, so it turns out that almost always I mean, almost always, you are murdered by somebody that you let get close enough to you to murder you.
mm,
Now, sometimes someone just rushes you, but most of the time, we call this the proximity principle. I call it that. And so when I work a case, like open a case, I'm looking, I'm saying, okay, so it more than likely it's somebody in her bullseye. It's somebody who's in her proximity. It's going to be either relational proximity or geographic proximity. That's it. So we'll start with relational. So who's in her bullseye? Well, who's she dating? Who's she sleeping with? Because that's probably the closest proximity she has relationally. But then it's going to be her friends, her most intimate friends, her loosely associated friends, her work associates. It's going to be relationships. So because most of us are killed by people we know.
yeah,
That's interesting. Now, if you know that in advance, that means you have to put a higher priority on who it is you know.
yeah.
That's why that one chapter is talking about like what are the kinds of friends that lead to human flourishing, especially since I work so many cases where people were killed by their alleged friends.
Yeah.
So we want to know what's the difference between the flourishing
Right.
friends and the non-flourishing friends. That's I think an important thing to learn,
Oh,
especially
so good.
and to teach your students, to teach your kids
Yep. Yep.
because they're making these choices. We are so contagious that we have to be careful who we're going to catch something from. Now, if you can't find someone in that relational circle, these are concentric circles, then I'm going to switch over to geography. Who's her neighbor? Who are her roommates? Who are the people who have geographic proximity to her? And the cases that stay open the longest that are just go cold, and I've got one of those that we just solved in 2019, but it was a case that occurred in 1972. And it's a case that I opened it and started reading it in mid 90s, and we didn't solve it until 2019 by Ancestry DNA because that stuff came online around 2017 for us. And so now here's what's interesting: that guy who killed this 10-year-old girl was a complete utter stranger. Now we often say when we work cold cases that when you finally figure out who it is 30 years later, he's probably going to be in the book. What I mean is he's somebody who was under investigation 30 years ago because of this proximity principle.
Mm,
So, although he couldn't make a case, if DNA finally identifies him 30 years later, I would expect to go back in the book. And now we've digitized all that, so I'd expect to kind of search the name search, and oh, there he is. Yep, okay, he was interviewed the next day, but okay, that makes sense. This guy was nowhere in the book
mhm,
because he was a complete stranger. He wasn't even from what we're in Los Angeles County. He was from San Diego County, just driving through one day and spotted the victim he wanted.
mhm,
Now, that kind of case is so hard to solve because of the proximity principle. So what I wanted to do is write a chapter where I worked backwards and kind of showed you, hey, who are you living close to you and why does that matter? And what did the studies show about flourishing? I might as well talk about it since we're talking about it right now. So there are three aspects. Now, the longest study done on this is about a 60-year study, and it's a study that looks at like what people would list as the most satisfying aspect of life. What is this thing that gives you the greatest happiness that can ensure long-term contentedness? What's relationships?
mhm,
Well, that tells us something, but what kind of relationships? Oh, okay, now that's where we're going to zero in. It turns out these are the kinds of relationships, and I have a story in this book of a woman who was killed by somebody she considered to be her best friend.
Mm.
So what does it take? Well, three things. Here they are. And I try to teach this to students at Summit Worldview Ministry. I try to teach this to my own kids. First, you're not going to have a lot of friends that are quality friends. You can have a lot of associates, people you know, but those people are probably not going to contribute to your flourishing. So if you think that somehow the everyone you know on Instagram is actually that you're basing your happiness on their opinions, okay, you're not following the principles. It's not a large group. The first attribute is a small group. It's a small group of number two, deeply committed, deep divers, people who know you so well and who you love so much as a friend that you will allow them to say, hey, knock that off, to speak truth to you.
Mm.
And you won't just push them away. And not all your friends. I mean, people, some of the people you know, if they were brutally honest with you on social media, you'd say, I'm going to unfollow that guy
Yeah.
because they're not part of that small, intimate circle, that proximity principle. They're not part of it. So I get that. So you have some friends that you actually would allow speak truth to you. It's a small group. But that's ends up that the killer in this story I talk about in this book, she met those two criteria. She was part of this victim's small group of deeply committed, deeply connected friends, but she lacked the third attribute, and that is virtue. So the studies show this, that you need a small group of deeply connected, virtuous friends. There's the problem, though, is that who gets to decide what is virtuous? And if you work like gangs, for example, and I've got several stories in this book when I work gangs, um, there's a code amongst thieves. There's a sense of what's right and wrong, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, what good and bad is amongst thieves. And you and I would not agree on what they find virtuous. But they would say, hey, you know what? If you come over here and do that in our neighborhood, you knew what we were going to do in response. And so you only did it because you know what the response is going to be. So you earned it and you know you're going to get it. And if we did it in your neighborhood, we'd expect you to respond that way to us. There's a code,
Mm.
but it's not a virtuous code. And
Right.
that's the problem when you allow groups to decide what's virtuous. And that's why we really, to be honest, the only way to have the kinds of friends who will help you to flourish in life is if they are grounding their virtue in something that's objectively, transcendently virtuous, a source of virtue that's not based on my personal opinions. Because that's what happened in this case is that they had a code. They were all living it very successfully, but the code wasn't virtuous. And because of that, it led to destruction. So that's why sadly, we tell our young people all the time, don't, you should, we make this advice we give our kids and they probably hear it like want, 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 want. But the reality of it is that as Christian believers, we're trying to just at least point that third dimension of quality relationships that all the studies will say will help you flourish is you've got to have a sense of virtue. But how do you ground it without God? So I think that part of it. Now, look, I would have said as a non-believer, because we became Christians about 18 years in. My wife and I were together for about 18 years before we became Christians. And all those years, I had a form of virtue. It turns out, to be honest with you, a lot of the virtue that I embraced was the remnant of a Judeo-Christian culture I was living in, even here in Southern California. In other words, I happened to be standing in a place that was pretty close for my notions of what right and wrong were pretty close to what they would have been if I would have been raised in the church.
Mm.
But I didn't know why they were that way. So when I finally looked at this Christianity, it wasn't like I was trying to fix broken systems in my own life or fix a broken anything because I had already adopted, like Dawkins, this
Yeah.
idea of virtue in the UK that comes from a culture that he rejects the foundation of it. He rejects Christianity, but he sure loves what it teaches.
Yeah.
And that was me. I rejected Christianity, didn't even know what it taught, but happened to accidentally embrace much of what it taught anyway. And that's what you see happening in the studies. People will end up aligning their conclusions with what Christianity has always taught about this and not even knowing they're doing that, which I think is cool because I think if they knew they were going to align themselves, they probably wouldn't. So I
Yeah.
loved it when they just find this accidentally find it on their own and they end up finding something ancient.
Yeah. Do you know who Andrew Tate is? You've heard of
Yes.
him. Okay.
Yep.
So I read an article. I was preparing for something a couple weeks ago, and I read an article in a recent interview of his
Okay.
where he switched from atheism to Islam. And his reasoning was because he realized there's evil And he said, if there's evil, then there's an equal and opposite force. And, all this, he's been in prison in Romania the last, like, I don't know, over the last year, he's been in there at some point. I think he's on house arrest now, or he was. And so kind of like the same, C.S. Lewis realized, hey, if I'm
Yeah.
realizing there's evil, but he goes, C.S. Lewis goes Christianity, Andrew Tate goes Islam. And so it was through evil that they both realized that God must exist. And so when you're on the force as an atheist for a while and you're coming
Mhm.
across all of these, well, it's all the bad guys, right? You're trying to clean up the
Yeah.
streets.
Yeah.
And my brother and my dad were police officers in Fresno, California.
Oh,
And it kind
awesome.
of it kind of hardened.
Fresno can be a tough city, I'll tell you
Yeah.
what. Go
Oh,
ahead.
yeah.
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 Mhm. Yep.
And my brother it's even kind of shaped him to be very skeptical of people. And
Yeah.
he used to have to use like tactics for drawing out the truth and things with
Yeah. Yeah.
for
Yeah.
questions and stuff. And he even tells me today, like, I could break them down to tell me the truth. Like he's just so confident in his ability.
Yes. Well,
But
it's because you do it all. It's muscle memory. It's like
yeah,
if you exercise it enough, it just becomes something you just do natural. Yeah, I get it.
yeah. And so he's got that, he still has that cop
Yeah.
mentality, even being off the force for a while. But when you were an atheist in that environment
Mhm.
and you're looking at human nature,
Yeah.
were you thinking anything like, was it, you know what I mean?
Well,
Like,
I don't think I've ever talked about this with anybody else, but I'll tell you. So I was raised by a single mom, and it was just the two of us. And she divorced my dad. My dad divorced her when I was about 3. So it was 1964. So so there weren't a lot of divorced 21-year-old women with a 3-year-old in 1964. But we were in that group, and my mom has kind of classic liberal sentiments. Classic liberalism, not the kind we're seeing right now. And so she raised me in a way that was very embracing of people, to see the best in people, to see us as all as I didn't really have, and I used to think of my dad as somebody who was just innately, and I love my dad, but I used to think of him whenever I'd be with him that, man, this guy is so negative. I mean, he sees the worst in everybody. And I was born in my dad's academy. So my entire life, he's been a cop.
mm,
So I'm like, okay, I love my dad, but that was an aspect of his nature I just could not put up with. And it was because my mom was so different. Well, then I did the job for about 5 years and I realized, oh, no, he's not pessimistic. He just, unfortunately, is realistic about human nature that he's seeing. And how I've been describing it is, if I'm holding up this mug and you don't know what's in it, the surest way to find out is to punch it. And when you nudge it, it'll spill, and then you'll see what's in there. And what you're doing when you're working these kinds of cases is you're interacting with people at that moment in their life when someone is punching their mug and it's spilling out. You're seeing what people are really like on the inside. And so there's a, like, if I was a Christian from the beginning, it might have been different. So there was definitely a season of just not hopelessness, but of just real pessimism when it comes to human natures, to how we, and there's also a sense of division that occurs because you never think of yourself as that guy.
yeah.
That's something that comes once you get a better sense of who we are. Spurgeon said that humility was the proper assessment of our nature, and it is. But you can't properly assess it if because you don't want to admit you're that guy. If you're constantly around people who are doing these kinds of things, and that's all you talk to, then of course you think you're different. Those are bad guys. You're a good guy.
Yeah.
I have a partner who used to always say that. He used to always say, um, Jim, we're not we're good guys. We take bad guys to jail. If
Mm,
there's a good God and a good heaven, we're going to be in it because we're good guys.
mm,
Not a believer, but just had a sense that if there is a God, I don't really need to do much more because I'm a good guy. So if there's a good God, I'll be okay. Well,
yeah.
what are we doing here? That's because we are in a job where we're constantly seeing and dividing over what we think is. That's why it's so important to get a grasp on your worldview first. We talk about in this book, there's a chapter on marriage, actually. But in that chapter, I talk about the stuff I talked about yesterday on the porch with the students
Mm,
at Summit Worldview Conference is like, hey, there's some trajectory decisions you're going to make as high schoolers in the next 5 years. What are they? In other words, the kinds of decisions that will set a course for the rest of your life. And you'd be surprised to hear how many think it's education, because they're right now applying to universities all over the country. So I get it. It makes sense. But I always tell them, no, your first trajectory decision is the one that every other decision is going to be based on, and it is worldview. Like, what is the truth about the nature of the world? If Christianity is not true, this is the time to walk away from it. But if
Yeah.
it is true, it's the time to lean in.
Mm.
So we need to figure that out first. But the second trajectory decision is not your education or your mission or your calling or your purpose. It's your spouse.
Mm.
And I don't think many people, and even though some might say, well, yeah, I agree, they're not intentional about this. They're intentional about applying for universities, and they're intentional about where they want to work and what they want to do and what they think they're gifted to do, but they have no idea how they're going to meet a spouse, and they just think they're going to eventually bump into one. And so we have to help young people see. And by the way, it's not a coincidence that most of those Dateline episodes are spousal murders.
Yeah.
Like, this is an important decision you're about to make. It's foundational. I've known people who made really poor career choices, but they had a life that glorified God and actually did a great kingdom work because they had an unbelievable marriage.
Yeah.
And I've also met the other opposite, great jobs. They're the chief of police. They've been married 3 times. Okay.
Yeah.
Like your relationship, this closest relationship that God has ordained, your marriage, it preaches. It preaches whether you think it preaches or not. It's preaching something.
Hmm.
So you have an opportunity with your marriage to tell the world about your worldview and show them something beautiful, or be another episode of Dateline. Those
Yeah.
are your choices. So we have to make that decision wisely. And that's why I wanted to do one chapter just on that. I try doing each chapter is to say, okay, look, if I'm making this claim, like, how do you get there from here? Like, that's the chase the lead section in each one of these
Yeah. That's
chapters,
good.
is like, hey, here's like 5 things you can look for, 5 things you can do, 5 ways to rethink this issue.
Hmm.
That's kind of what it is more, unlike my other books, this is a pastoral book. This is like, hey, where does the rubber meet the road?
Hmm.
Now that you think Christianity is true, now that you've kind of looked at the evidence, now what?
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is a now what book.
That chapter on marriage was really good too, because I like how you said that your marriage preaches something, even if you don't think it does. And if you form that into a question, if the reader does and says, what does my marriage preach?
Right.
That's because I thought of that. I actually remember what I was doing when I was listening to that. I was folding laundry and I was like, what does my marriage preach? Like, you want it, like how I treat my husband to my children, in front of my children, in front of my family, in front of my friends, in public and behind closed doors. It it's showing them how marriage should be as well. And you also use
Absolutely it
that
is.
when we're going to talk about this, I actually have a question for you about it, but we're talking about it. We
Well, we'll do it. Ask the question right now, because
Okay.
we're going to
Well,
jump all over the place. And I love that we're talking about this topic, because most of the time I talk about this book, I mean, it's all kinds of, there's 15 weird things in this
mhm,
book that I think are surprising aspects of human flourishing. But I think the most controversial one is marriage,
it
because we're
is.
in a culture that has rejected the value of
Yeah.
marriage and the form of marriage, both. Like, anything seems to be we're calling everything marriage.
Jim,
And the
did you
reality of it
see?
is,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
no,
interrupt you.
go. Yeah,
But
please.
did you see Harrison Butker's speech? And he's getting
Yeah.
crucified over
No,
it. And
oh,
he's
yeah.
saying like the man is shedding tears over his wife being
Yeah,
his support. And I have seen it's women and men alike just coming out and be like, oh my gosh. And
I
he's
know.
kind of saying what you're saying, like my
Well, the
marriage.
response I'm hearing in the culture to him is actually even more shocking to me than what he said, right? So
Yes.
this is one of the things I say in this book chapter on marriage is, and I was just listening to someone talk about how marriage is often seen as kind of like this transactional arrangement
Yes.
between the two spouses.
Okay.
I'm going to do this much, you're going to do that much. I don't do this, you don't do that. That has never been Susie and I's approach. Now, I say it, and I don't think I was able to. It's so funny, because this is another one of those areas that if you write about marriage, there are people who are Gen Z and who are millennials who will say, "Are you single shaming me?"
Mm,
Because they're now in their 30s, they're not married, and they're like, "Well, this is okay." I'm not single shaming, but the data is pretty clear that marriage has unbelievable benefits for both partners. It
yeah.
just does. And I've collected all that data. And to be honest, the data only in the last 15 years are you starting to see studies where people are making a conscious effort to subvert the data to show that, oh, anything is fine. Well, good luck with that. I mean, I actually quote one researcher who says, if it's not for a presuppositional bias against this traditional form, none of these surveys would even exist, these
Wow.
contrary surveys. But the reality of it is that if you look at the data, that not only is it good for us, it's good for our kids because children raised by two biological parents in a low conflict setting do better than any other group of kids. It's just sad but true, but it is. I was not raised that way. So I understand what it's to be from a broken home.
Mhm.
I didn't raise my family that way. I have two adopted children and two biological children. I have a blended family.
Mm.
But the best thing for everyone would have been if we could be raised by our two biological parents in a low complex setting. I don't know why that seems like, if even as an atheist, it seems to me that that's just so obvious because just from a genetic perspective, when my sons, who are my biological sons, when they mess up or do something, I can look at them and go, oh, I know where he got that.
Right.
I do the same thing because I've got a biological connection and so much of your biology determines your behavior.
Right.
It's
Right.
just we see the genetic connections. Okay. So I don't know why this is controversial, but what I try to say in this is that this is not a transaction. Two things. I think that the cultural view that marriage is a contract, and if you think about it, why do you form contracts? You form contracts because you don't want the other person to renege on what their promise was. In other words, they're formed on the basis of distrust. You form a contract with somebody you don't really trust because you want the contract to legally bind that person who you expect at some point to try to get out of the deal.
Yeah.
So it starts off from a position of, yeah, I'm going to form something that's going to hold you in place instead of it being a covenant between two believers and a holy third party. Okay. That's a very different approach. It's not based on distrust. It's based on a love of God. What's the point in even doing this? If it's
Yeah.
not, now look, I'll tell you, I was not a Christian for 18 years into my relationship with Susie. For the first 9 years before we were married, we were together for 9 years before we got married. So look, I get it. I get what it is to live a different kind of life. But it turns out that accepting the covenant versus the contract is part of this. And secondly, and this is something I tell couples, is that it's not a 50-50 and it's not a 100-100. It's 100-0.
Mm.
That's the relationship I have with Susie. In other words, my goal is to do what I'm supposed to do, to give her all of it with zero expectations in response to that. I have zero expectations from Susie. I want to outperform her. Okay. I want to do it. And if she doesn't respond, I'm not doing it for the response. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do before God. Now, once I started doing that, she saw it. And it was after I became a Christian.
Mm.
In other words, every argument, for example, I know is not between me and Susie. It's between me and Jesus. I'm going to have to apologize to Jesus for something I'm about to say. I don't want to do that. So I recognize I'm taking her out of the equation. If she says something to me, that's not what I say is between me and God. What she says is between her and God. It's no longer between her and me.
Yeah.
That changed everything.
Mm.
And then what happens is your spouse says, "Oh, really? I can beat you. I can do more for you with no expectation than you can do for me." And when two people are in a relationship where it's a 100-0, oh, it's crazy good. It
Yeah.
just is because it's no longer transactional. I will only do this if.
Right.
And that is poison in a relationship like ours. I mean, this is if you and why? Because it's selfish. In other words, if I'm doing this because I expect something from you, then really the only reason why I'm doing it is selfish
Hmm.
because I want that thing that I want.
Yeah.
And this is what Luther says about our human nature, that it's so deeply fallen, that we are so inwardly turned, that even when you can look, selfishness can lead you to moral behavior, but you're doing it for the wrong reason, but you're acting morally. But
Right.
it turns out you're doing it for selfish reasons. So this is what Luther's argument was, is that even those who do things that are in line with what God would want them to do are doing them for the wrong reason.
Yeah.
Even that is depraved. Even that has got no value because we're doing it for selfish reasons. And that's true in marriage for sure.
Yeah.
So we have to take that equation out. It cannot be a transaction. Now, so that means that you have to say, well, as a husband, I'm going to give it all to you. And then as a wife, if you want to take that same approach, you're going to give it all to me. But it means I'm not going to measure whether I got something in return. Now, here's what I think is changing and why our marriage is changing in the culture here in California, at least, is that it's almost impossible for me to take a traditional role. If I said my traditional role, it used to be, especially in an agricultural culture or an industrial culture, that the jobs favored that men were, based on strength and muscle mass. If that's how economies are running, well, then yeah, then whoever's stronger and has more muscle mass is going to be the probably the more adequate provider. That's changed, and there's no one in California I know of can even own a home on one income.
Right.
So
True.
so now everyone, you have two spouses who are basically doing the exact same thing. So we're going to have to renegotiate what it is from a role perspective, even to live, or more importantly, do I really need that house? If I'm going to adopt these roles that I think I'm designed by God to adopt, what is it that is causing me to abandon those roles? A lot of it is economics,
Yep.
but it's probably not something you need. It's something you want.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have to figure out how can I get what I need, but not what I necessarily, not these things that the culture is trying to tell me I should want. How
Yes.
do I just live on with what I need? I remember Susie used to always say at some point, she's got her master's degree in speech pathology.
Mm.
And so early on, it was clear that she could make more money than I could as a cop. Even though I had a master's degree in architecture, I just didn't think that was going to be a good profession for us as a family. So I walked away from that profession because I just saw it was a workaholic profession to law enforcement that I knew we were going to make a lot less money. So now I didn't even have a car that my first new car. I mean, you have to change the things you value.
Yeah.
I'm driving Hyundais. I've always not that nothing's wrong with I like Hyundais, but these are always at the bottom of the line in terms of cost.
Sure.
And that's what you okay, that's all we need. Okay, you buy the house that's in the oldest neighborhood and it's the smallest model. You do what you have to do because you're trying to figure out like what's important for our relationship. And then when Susie wanted to homeschool, well, how do you do that?
Yeah.
That was her desire to do that. So I'm going to have to be able to do this on one income. And so you just figure out how to do that. And so this, and by the way, if we are saying as a group, as Christians, that there's value in homeschooling, well, then how do you manage that? We're going
Right.
to have to change some things about
Yes.
how we see what's important in our marriage.
Yeah, I've always said too, as Dean and I will be married 23 years in about a week. And I tell people you learn to be married because you learn each other. Like, but you have to take advice. Like that advice that you give in that chapter and what you've been giving right now is good for couples to remember it's not 50-50. It's not even because people have changed it to it's 100% and 100%. But when you're thinking it's all of me and I don't have to expect anything from them, that's just going to be tough. But it's good to think of it that way because then it's
Mhm.
not like you said transactional. And I thought that
Right.
that was a great use of words because when you're doing, in the middle of a transaction, you're exchanging one thing for another, value for value, right? If you're buying something, it's money for that object. And that's just not how we should be treating our spouses. But I think that people need to hear these things because they're learning to be married. It's a
Yes.
long game.
It is, and there's two things that are dangerous about it, right? So if it's a transactional relationship, two things have to happen. One, almost always in a transaction, someone feels they got the better end of the deal. And that's fine when you're
Yeah.
buying a car. What are you buying? You're wagering back and forth to get the best price, so you can feel like and go, yeah, I got a good price for this, which means you took that guy for something. That's he's trying to do the same thing to you, and probably he's going to win. But that's one thing. Two, transactions, and if you're keeping records, you have to keep records.
Mm,
So that
mm,
means that in your mind, you're actually have a tally of
yeah.
what you've done and what they've done. And if you get keeping tallies, oh my goodness, that's poison. There's nothing good that comes out of keeping tallies. Now, here's the danger in it. If I'm going to say I'm going to give Susie 100% with no expectations, and by the way, your expectations determine your level of satisfaction. If you think you're going to a five-star restaurant and it's 4.5, it's really good, but it's supposed to be five. Now suddenly you're disappointed by a great restaurant. Why? Because your expectations were high.
Mm,
So when your expectations are low, suddenly you're just pleased all the time. That's why it's important for you to give 100% with zero expectations. Trust me, you're not going to get zero. But now, because that's your expectation, everything is delightful. Now, here's the problem with it. The problem is that if you're with somebody in a relationship who's abusive or will take advantage of that, who doesn't see their relationship with God the same way that you see, that doesn't think of every argument, every discussion, every effort you make as your relationship with Jesus. So it's between you and God.
mm.
And then if they don't see it that way, then you can fall into abuse because they'll just continue to take until finally you're at the wrong side of the sword. I get that. And this is why I remember there's a radio host. I'm not sure if she's older than me. Her name is Dr. Laura, and she used to have a radio show. It's now online. It's private. And Dr. Laura said she's very harsh sometimes. She's very like right to the point. Don't, you're a fool. You did this wrong. Blah blah blah. So she'll just tell you. But she says makes a point of saying you have to. And I quote her in this book. I think yeah I do, where you have to choose wisely and then treat kindly. That's all you got to do. Choose wisely and treat kindly. And here's the problem. Most people who call her, or people we talk to, they never chose wisely.
Mm,
And now they're struggling to treat kindly. So
mm,
it turns out you have to be intentional before you begin. So if you share a same worldview and you discuss this issue with each other, you're far more likely to actuate it in your own life, in your own marriage.
yeah.
Because if you don't choose, this is what we're getting sometimes up in the couples that come to the resiliency training is that maybe didn't even think about their choices really in these categories. So they didn't maybe choose wisely from this perspective. So then the question becomes, well, how do I treat kindly somebody I didn't choose wisely?
Yeah.
And that's why this had better be about you and God.
Mm,
And you had better find your joy in God. And there's a chapter in this book also that talks about celebrity and idolatry.
yeah.
and and I have to struggle. I struggle with this because I have an idol. We're all master craftsmen of idol. I think it's Calvin who calls us that, and it's very very true. And my idol is if I'm not careful, it'll be marriage because that was the thing of utmost importance to me before I met the God of utmost importance.
Mm,
So that's the idol I have to constantly surrender to Him because that was the first and foremost way I saw myself. In other words, I always told Susie, we are collecting a series of consecutive faithful years with
mhm,
each other. And when we were married, we were almost at 10. And I was so proud. My pride was grounded in that I had been with this girl for 10 years.
mm,
And that was the first thing I would have said about myself is who are you? I'm Susie's boyfriend and we've been together for 10 years. That would
mm,
have been probably one of the first things out of my mouth because that was the idol. And whatever it is you value most, that is, we all worship. That's the point of that chapter. And it turns out that we create idols and sex, money, and power
yeah.
that ought to be things that we are using for God's glory, but we twist them into idols, and then we end up killing each other over them.
Yeah.
And that's often, that's why we look for those three motives in murders because those are the idols that humans create.
Yes.
And
That's what I was
relationships
going to
are,
ask
yeah,
you. How did you
yeah.
realize that too, that those were the three motivating or driving factors in a
Um,
murder?
I'm I think it was not it wasn't in a class like a murder seminar because when you start working homicide you'll go to schools. They'll
Mm,
send you to the schools. LAPD will put them on, or Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department will put them on, and you'll sit and learn from other investigators certain basic principles of investigation. But that's not where I learned. That's really something you just learn by working the cases. After a while, you go, oh, okay, and you don't even realize you're doing that.
yeah.
But they do fall into those three categories.
I
And
just felt, yeah.
if you go back and look at your cases, if you're an investigator, I challenge you, go back and look at your cases. You'll see that it's all about sex, money, and power. Sex, money, power, sex, money, power. There's no fourth category. There
Yeah.
just is. Now,
That's
if you're saying, well,
fascinating to me.
if you say he's just crazy, well, that's okay. Well, if he's criminally insane, we can't prosecute him. I'm
Sure.
talking about the cases we can prosecute. Okay.
Yeah.
And of
Yeah.
those cases, there's only three motives. So, and if you protect yourself, by the way, from those three motives, you'll be a better pastor. You'll be a better husband. And that's the point of that chapter is that you saw it, we've seen it, Christian leaders. You cannot scratch one of these three without scratching the other two. And here's what happens in churches. Churches will say, well, I'm going to protect my pastor from relationships. I'll put some system in place that makes sure he doesn't have any one-on-ones with women, whatever. Or I'm going to protect him from money. We're going to make, he's going to be paid well enough to live. We're going to give him a parsonage, but we're going to really make sure we moderate how much income, blah, blah, blah. Well, here's what they don't do. They don't protect them from fame. As a matter of fact, they want their pastor to be famous. They want their pastor to have a TV show and a podcast and everything that's going to draw more people to the church because they see this as a positive. The fame is positive, but the sex and money are negative. It turns out they're all negative. They all can be turned toward negative
Mhm.
because the fame is in that power category, authority, respect. That's in the power section. And if you scratch that itch, you will eventually scratch one of the other two. And we see this all the time. People they didn't really have access to the things they could have had until they had fame and money. And now suddenly a woman comes along that is drawn to the fame and money often. And we see this in celebrities all the time.
Yeah.
Celebrity, we have to reject it. We have to reject it. And this is one of the things we talked about at CIA, right? We talk about the difference between trusted authority,
Mm.
which we get. That's what allows us. That's why people are listening to your podcast. They trust you as an authority. That's important. And that's why they read my books. They trust me as an authority. But I've got to reject celebrity.
Yeah.
And for me, what that meant was I became more and more uncomfortable in those situations where it was clear somebody thought I was a celebrity.
Mm.
So, for example, you're at a book table, and I get it. People want you to sign a book. You buy a book, they want you to sign their book. I get that. But what is my signature worth? Okay, zero. Why does anyone? I look at it, I'm like, oh, this is so celebratory. This is all about celebrity. Worse, at some point in that line, someone's going to say, can I take a picture with you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not going to say no. I hate it because I feel like I'm not a celebrity.
Yeah.
And and it's dangerous. I don't want to be a celebrity. So what I found myself doing at this age now is I say no to almost every invitation to speak.
Mm.
I do some things locally, but I'm so uncomfortable with if the stage is going to cause someone to think I am a celebrity, then we have to reject the stage.
Yeah.
Like, how do we take our own advice seriously? And and part of this is the identity chapter. Like, I have to start to say, who am I really?
Mm-hmm.
Is that who I think I am?
Mm-hmm.
Like, who am I really? And one of the things that helped me, I think, this all happened. God ordains these series of events for a reason. Is when we became grandparents. So I've got my granddaughter not here. She just came back for a walk. She's 14 months old. But what that did for me is it made me realize, that I'm Opa,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what I'm going to be from now until I die. And it helped me to say, hey, wake up.
Yeah.
That other stuff's not who you are. This
Yeah.
is who you are. And luckily, we have our granddaughter like 4 days a week. So we were able to remind ourselves on a daily basis that this is really who we are.
Yeah.
And it's healthy, right? Because it helps us to resist in a public world where you're writing books.
Yeah.
And I always say anyone can write a book. That's not the trick. Getting someone to read it is the trick.
Mm-hmm.
And then you end up in front of a camera like we are today.
Yeah.
And someone's listening to you and you're thinking, oh, this guy must be somebody. No, I'm a nobody.
Yeah.
And I better remind myself every day
Yeah.
because that's the healthier way to live. That's what leads to the one thing that leads, and this is a different chapter, but the one thing that leads to flourishing faster and more robustly than anything else is this often studied attribute that is not much known in the secular world. They don't talk about it much, but it's humility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So humility is the one key that unlocks the door to everything else good in your life.
Yeah.
Yet it's the thing we are most inclined against. When the snake says to Eve, um, he didn't really say that. He
Yeah.
just doesn't want you to know what he knows. It's like, yeah, you're actually somebody. You're good enough. You could be as smart as him. That's a pride issue, right? We have to reject the things that cause us to not be humble. And it's really hard, I think, in a culture that probably the people we're listening to, the social commentators that the radio hosts we're listening to,
Mhm.
probably don't sound all that humble. They probably sound like they're pretty convinced and and we listen to that.
Yeah.
It just amplifies it in our own soul. So we have to really, and if I'm going to take this advice seriously, we have to figure out a way to step back, yet still hopefully create some content that will help people, that'll move the ball in God's court without. And I struggle with it because some of my biggest people I work with, are
Mhm.
at Billy Graham Association. These are people who are public figures. Billy Graham preached the gospel, it became famous doing it, and I can tell you, everything I've learned about him from his kids and his grandchildren, he was the real deal.
Mm.
Okay, he never thought highly of himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was just the real deal from everything I can glean from his family. But that's the struggle for me.
Yeah.
And I think it's for anyone who's in the public sphere. We have to figure out how do you remain a trusted authority but reject celebrity.
I always have thought about, I don't know that man, like humans, are capable of standing on a stage and having applause. I don't know that
Mm,
we're wired for that. I
I
don't think
agree.
I would say we're not wired for it, but I don't know that we can
Mm,
handle it without it.
yeah.
What you have to have a conscientious fight to not let that change you. And I think a lot about, King Saul, what the words that God told him when he said, "Remember when you were small in your own eyes, and I
Yeah.
took you from your place and I put you into that position." And I just like, "Ugh, Lord, I pray that you will always remind me of who I am. I am a woman who needs God every single minute of every day. And if I don't start my day by saying, how do I know God more?" When I was 17, I was raised in church. Thank God I had very diligent parents who took me to church, and then it was Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and I was like, "Do we have to go to church all the time?" Like, I was like, I would pray that we wouldn't go to church. That's how I prayed. And I just remember walking in high school one day and saying some prayer, and at the end of it, I said, "I love you, God, amen." And as soon as I said, "I love you," there was a question that came to my mind, and it was like, "Do you really love God? Like, you don't even know him."
Mm,
And I was it was so sobering because my mom wasn't there and I wasn't at church. There was nobody
yeah.
I could ask. I had to like deal with it. I had to move through that
Yeah.
that on my own. And I remember being kind of afraid because I thought, well, I know what this means. Like if I don't love God, like I know what that means. I've been raised in church. And so I had this moment of opportunity to either be truthful or to not. And I said, I'm going to tell God the truth. And I said, God, I don't love you because I don't know you. Like I have to know this for myself.
Yeah.
And I remember my prayer turning into a very just, I started to seek God to know him. And I said, God, I just want to know you. Like, I don't care whatever you want me to do, wherever you want me to go, whatever you want me to say, I'll do that. But I've got to know you. And I just remember saying those three things: I'll do it, I'll say it, I'll go. But if I don't know you, none of it, nothing matters. And I tell myself now in my 40s, I look back to when I was a teenager and I think, if I ever lose that prayer of God, I want to know you, then I've lost my way because that's all this is about. But when I'm reading your book and I'm hearing like the human struggles, like the struggle of
Yeah.
human nature, I'm just like, Lord, if you don't hold on to me,
Oh,
how am I gonna make it?
that
And
is
I,
a great, I know we're going to run out of time here,
yeah.
but I'm going to tell you that's a great place to end it because you're absolutely right. Well, all this did for me working these cases was reveal to me how much I'm everyone I've ever worked.
Mm,
I'm everyone I've ever investigated, and but for the grace of God, that knowing that every day I'll find a new way to mess it up.
yeah,
That I have to ask God for help in areas that I can't predict tomorrow what I'm going to need help with because I'm such a train wreck that I'll find a new way tomorrow. Um, that sobering truth is hard to come to under any other worldview. Think about it.
yeah,
So that's why this is so important for us to be able to communicate to our kids. That it turns out that this, if you ever hope to find out, have a proper assessment of who you are, you'd have to stand before the holy God who created you. You're not going to, because if you're going to compare yourself to other humans, you'll find a way to leverage that you're better.
yeah.
It's really in comparison to the holy God that I realize, oh, no, that's a great place to end it because I think you're absolutely right. Look, I'm just so delighted that we got to meet each other, that we're part of a group of people who are even talking about these issues,
Mhm,
and that we are in the same. It's one thing to be united by a common cause, and we are.
mhm.
It's another thing to be or common interest or a common technology because we are.
Yeah,
It's another thing to be united by a common father.
sure.
It's totally different.
Yeah,
And that's where I think that's why we can say, yeah, I got off the phone with my sister today.
yeah,
I
yeah.
got off because that's the case. So I just appreciate you having me and
I
being willing to
appreciate
talk
it.
about these things.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. I'm so thankful that we got to do this, Jim. Thank you so much. Now tell us again the name of the book and where we can find
Oh, it's I said now the pitch. I hate this part. So
What's the
yeah, it's called The
webpage?
Truth and True Crime, but we've got a website called thetruthandtruecrime.com where I try to give away as much free stuff with the purchase that will make up for anything you think you have to spend on the purchase. And yes, this week we came out with the video curriculum for this at Right Now Media. I think it came out really good. You'll find the links to that also on thetruthandtruecrime.com. So I hope you'll visit it and let me know what you think.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for being here. I hope that you guys enjoy listening to this. I know I enjoyed having this conversation. I'll leave all the links in the show notes. And if you have any questions for me, you can email me at hello@shandafulbright.com, and I'll catch you on the next one.